It's going to be a tough sell. Commissioner Rob Manfred's got to cut a deal sort of with the owners on the revenue sharing side, and also with the players union on the side of, okay, a cap, but also with a floor. So it's not going to be easy.
What is up, baseball fans, and welcome to this special Sports Talk interview. I'm Jason Burgos, and I have the pleasure of being joined by a true expert of the business side of professional sports, and that is CNBC senior sports reporter Michael Ozanian. Michael, thanks so much for the time today.
Oh, my pleasure, Jason. Thanks for having me.
So, bunch of questions for you today. So, this past week, CNBC released your all-new official MLB team valuations for 2025. So, explain the specific criteria used for your list. That saw the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Red Sox, no surprises at the top. And if there were maybe any surprises when you went through digging into all the details for each club.
Well, what we basically do is we reconstruct the profit and loss statements and balance sheets for all of these teams using various sources. Could be team executives, league people, documents that we get. And once we figure out what the revenues, EBITDA and debt and all of that is for each of these teams, and as well as the markets they play in, the stadiums they have, their TV deals going forward, all that stuff, we look at past transactions. In other words, going through the last several years, what were the prices relative to the revenue for the teams that have been sold? And based on that, primarily, we value each of the teams. We also look in certain instances when teams are or have been out there raising money. So, for instance, you mentioned one of the surprises, the Athletics, who are playing in Sacramento this season. Mm-hmm. They're moving from Oakland on the way to Las Vegas. They've been raising money at the $2 billion valuation range for their new ballpark. The Philadelphia Phillies have done a lot of capital raises over the past year, and they've been raising money at a $3.2 billion valuation. So we use that information as well.
Now, sports betting is becoming a greater influence on pro leagues as a lot of them are getting in bed with these major betting companies. Did betting have any notable effect on how you set up your rankings? And are there any teams that kind of benefit more than others based on betting in different states?
Indirectly, absolutely, Jason. Major League Baseball set a record for sponsorship revenue during 2024. Could quite possibly surpass that record this year. Wow. And the advertising and sponsorship by the betting companies, DraftKings, FanDuel. In fact, FanDuel has rebranded some of the old Diamond regional sports networks, as you know. So that money has come in and helped the league and helped individual teams. As far as what teams have been helped the most, in a gross revenue sense, you're largely talking about which teams play in the biggest markets and which teams also perhaps have a stake in their regional sports network. So, for instance, the Yankees, which own a chunk of the S network, that's been a big help for them. There are some teams that have TV locked in. So the Dodgers get close to $200 million in rights fees and advertising revenue for their local cable TV deal, by far the most in baseball. But that's contractual. That's locked in with Charter based on a TV deal shortly after Guggenheim bought the Dodgers.
And that's interesting. As a person, a native New York, I know like how big these networks are and how much it benefit was for the Mets to get SNY and stuff like that. How has the collapse of like these regional sports networks and the significant TV revenue loss for many small market teams, how did it impact franchise values this year? And were there any that would have been much higher if not for all that stuff going on in Diamond Sports?
Yeah, and generally, probably about half would have been higher. What you've had happen over the past year is that if you look at the 2024 season, local TV revenue, which that's what you're talking about with RSNs, it's not the national deals with TBS and ESPN, that revenue was down about 5% last year.
Wow.
This year, it's going to fall another 5%. Overall impact on baseball. Well, during 2024, baseball hit a all-time record revenue mark of 12.1 billion, 500 million more than the previous year. But obviously, without that 5% decline in local TV, it would have been even higher. Baseball was carried during the 2024 season to its record revenue level by sponsorship revenue, some of that driven by the sports betting advertising you mentioned, but also attendance, and coupled with the attendance were higher ticket prices. So baseball revenue likely this season, as local TV money slips again, maybe 4 or 5%, could possibly go another 3% higher due to the sponsorship revenue. And also some teams like the Mets you mentioned with SNY, like the Yankees, like the Dodgers, their RSNs have contractually obligated revenue rights fees they have to pay the teams. And they're also, unlike the diamond ones, not in those precarious financial situations. So they're, not about to collapse. Prior to the decline in RSN money, local TV overall for the league was contributing a little over 20% to the league's overall revenue. Last year, it fell to about 19%. And, I'm guessing this year, if projections hold up, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 18%.
Wow. So, baseball's or MLB is a very traditional league, and they, do things the way they've done it for a long time. It takes a long time for changes, but going off of how there has been so much trouble sometimes with these regional deals and stuff like that, you see NFL with their national deals that they sell off to all these networks and these streaming service. And I'm sure MLB sees that there's been those kind of rumors that might be a possibility, especially after all this Diamond Sports fiasco. Is that something that's kind of like, is that really where it's heading? Is it like when the CBA is up in a couple of years? Is that something that MLB is really going to push for, and that's the direction? Because not just the league itself, like these teams that are suffering from these networks and stuff going under, they're like, yes, we want that because we want the money from that.
No, Jason, I think you've hit on the trifecta, actually, and you mentioned the CBA. So there's one more season after 2026, the CBA expires. So what you're talking about really is, and we mentioned the trifecta, there's three things that a lot of people would like to see happen to get to, if you're talking about, what's the ultimate to increasing Major League Baseball team values. So those three things would be: one, you get some sort of salary cap because it's the only major U.S. team sport without a cap. Yep. But with that, you got to have a salary floor, right?
Yeah.
So, and then you mentioned, how do you transition from local TV to more national TV where the money's split? We've seen baseball take over the local TV rights for a few teams. What I think you're going to have to do to get there is, if you're going to get teams like the Yankees and the Dodgers to forego some of their local TV money for that national, you're going to have to give them something in return. And I think that would have to be less revenue sharing. So, as you know, Major League Baseball has a revenue sharing system where 48% of the net local revenue is pooled and then distributed and yada, yada, yada. Basically, what it comes down to is, the Dodgers, the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Cubs, the Giants, they're subsidizing basically, 7 or 8 teams at the bottom, keeping them in business. So you're going to have to go to the Yankees and Dodgers and say, look, you're not going to have to put in that money anymore, because otherwise there's no incentive. I mean, how are you going to get the Dodgers to give up $200 million a year in local TV money and still say to them, and you still got to contribute $140 million or something like that to revenue sharing? So it's going to be a tough sell. Commissioner Rob Manfred's got to cut a deal sort of with the owners on the revenue sharing side, and also with the players union on the side of, a cap, but also with a floor. So it's it's not going to be easy.
And that's perfect. That transitions to where I was going anyway, because that's not going to be easy. Agreeing to both sides of that. It's like, especially all the stuff with deferrals we've seen, the Dodgers used it. Not that they're the first ones to use it. They just used it, honestly, the best. And we've had this speculation about maybe there's a lockout in 2027 when the CBA comes up and stuff like that. Do you think the trend of deferrals and like these contracts heading to absurd levels, what you mentioned, the idea of, we need a salary cap, but it's also need a floor. Like, what's your sense? Is that where we might be? Is that where we headed? Like a lockout or strike or something like that? And how bad would that be for MLB to lose, a percentage of games in a couple of years after everything you mentioned, like profits are up, MLB's doing good, all these kinds of things are positive?
Well, it would be very bad financially for the teams in the short term. And it would be something where in recent years, they haven't exactly stuck together, which is why they haven't done it. But at the same time, you got to think, you look at baseball, its operating margin, is like 5% for the teams versus, and that's, to be fair, it's largely due to the fact that the Mets have lost so much money. The Mets are losing like $280 million, but still you got an operating margin of 5% for baseball, 20% for hockey, basketball, and the NFL. But at the same time, you got to look at, say, what Gary Bettman did, right? Gary Bettman had 2 major lockouts with the NHL. He kept the owners together, and he ended up getting that hard cap. I mean, it's the hardest cap among the 4 leagues, and it's had a profound impact on the league's profits as well as franchise values in the NHL. I mean, the Tampa Bay Lightning last year just sold for $1.8 billion.
Yeah.
And that's, that's not a big market team. And, at 8 times revenue, that's a pretty rich price. That would not have happened. They would have got nowhere close to that had there not been a salary cap in the NHL. So, I think the answer to your question is, how badly do the Major League Baseball owners want it? Because if they're not in unison and they're not willing to stick together, then it's not something I think that will come to fruition.
So, in a business sense, and not what's going on the field, because of course, that hurts the fans and everything like that. But in a business sense, would you almost say a lockout or some kind of situation like that is almost necessary for the betterment of baseball, kind of like what you said with NHL and stuff like that, because cost of contracts are getting out of control, and now we're getting to the deferrals and all these kinds of things and TV deals, or maybe not. NHL is kind of different. MLB is just its unique thing, and that's kind of the problem what the league will always have. As long as they're making money, they're not going to care.
Yeah, no, I think baseball cares. I think it's something that they want. I don't think it's necessarily something you have to have a strike or a lockout about. However, I think the situation with deferrals is a little unique. Like, you mentioned the Dodgers, who do by far the most in deferrals. The Dodgers have a very unique situation in terms of the owners are with Guggenheim Asset Management. Some people have explained to me the Dodgers are able to do these huge deferral deals, the first one being with Otani, of course, because of the way they're able to offset the risk with insurance contracts that they work through with Guggenheim. So it's not something that I think is germane to all of baseball. That is, I don't think deferrals are a problem with all of baseball. I think that's a unique situation with the Dodgers. I think the bigger issue is competitiveness. How do you make it so that, you just don't have 3 or 4 teams every year that, have a real legitimate shot of winning the World Series? How do you get teams like Tampa Bay in there and Cincinnati and, cases like that? And there's one final thing I'd like to say too, which I think may get more of these owners to stick together, particularly some of the high revenue owners. It's very, it really burns some of these guys that in some cases, these teams who get the money in revenue sharing, and I'm talking about they're getting big checks, 40 million, 45 million every year, and they're not really spending it on players. They're not building up their rosters. The owners are essentially putting the money in their pocket or in some cases in other areas in the organization, but it's not showing up on the field. And so every year, they're not good. I mean, the Twins have been terrible this year. The Pittsburgh Pirates are almost an afterthought now. Pittsburgh is a great sports town. They got a great ballpark there. You put a good product on the field, they've shown they would, they'll draw. So, I think having less of that revenue sharing would also get some of these other owners to come on board. So it's sort of like it's a big puzzle, basically three big pieces that baseball's got to put together, which is salary cap with a salary floor, more centralized revenue, which is what you mentioned, and also then less revenue sharing from those high revenue teams. And if you could get all of that, in one place, then I think there's a good chance you could perhaps do something without a strike or a lockout.
I just have two last questions for you. You mentioned the Twins. The Minnesota Twins are up for sale. The current reports are the owners are looking for 1.7 billion, but there's supposedly a 425 million in debt that would come with the sale. How could that impact the sale process in your mind, and how long do you think it might take to finally sell the Twins?
Well, if the reports are analyzing it correctly, when you value these teams, and what we're talking about in these values really is these are enterprise values. So this is the equity plus the debt. So that debt you mentioned on the Twins would be included as part of that 1.7. Yeah. I just think 1.7 it's not an easy sell. One of the ways baseball teams can help their revenue, their baseball related revenue, is by events they put on in their ballparks, non-baseball events like concerts, things like that. Yeah. It's tougher to do in Minnesota because of the weather, right? Yeah. So, if you're in Miami or you have a dome ballpark someplace, or out in Arizona or LA, it's easier with the weather. Minnesota's tough. It's not a long summer out there, so that would be very interesting. I think getting 1.7 for Minnesota probably doesn't happen unless something like what you mentioned does happen, which is you get sort of a better economic structure with the next CBA in baseball.
All right, last question. A lot of baseball fans, because you're the business guy, this element, they'll look going back to the Dodgers. They're like, how are they paying for all these people? This is crazy. Okay, I get deferrals. Yeah, the money's later. But I've heard stories about how the Dodgers, they put money in investments and they're kind of in escrow and they kind of are working to pay off Otani's money later. Like, in a general sense, how can the Dodgers do what they do? Because also the reports are they're still making money. They're making money from Japanese stuff and all these kinds of things. And they're not necessarily, is that right? Are they losing money for the betterment of the team because they're trying to build the brand for the next 20 years? Or are there unique ways on a business sense that when they're deferring, they're going to make money and still easily pay off an Otani and a Freeman, all these contracts, 10 years from now?
Well, I think the best way to look at it is in the simplest way is they are using their relationship with Guggenheim and these financial instruments to help defer the contracts. That said, however, there's no question their revenues have really increased a lot over the last few years. They've you got to give credit where credit is due. They've done a great job with marketing, promotion, building up their fan base globally, in Japan. And they have the biggest ballpark in Major League Baseball. They have the highest attendance in Major League Baseball. They, before revenue sharing, they have the highest revenue in baseball, and they have by far the richest local TV in baseball. So, there is a lot of money coming in there.